On a frozen platform in Silver Ridge, Montana, a 58-year-old woman stood abandoned. Her mail-order groom had taken one look at her graying hair and walked away without a word. Margaret Hale had traveled 800 miles with nothing but a worn suitcase and a heart full of hope, only to be left stranded in a town of strangers. But what happened next would shake this frontier community to its core. This is the story of a woman who refused to break, a stranger who saw her strength, and a love that proved it's never too late to begin again. The train's whistle cut through the cold February air like a blade, its mournful cry echoing across the snow-covered plains of Montana Territory. Margaret Hale pressed her gloved hand against the frost-rimmed window, watching the landscape transform from the gentle hills of Wyoming into something wilder, more unforgiving. The year was 1891, and she was traveling toward a future she could barely imagine. Around her, the train car buzzed with the quiet conversations of fellow travelers. A young couple with a fussy infant, two miners returning from failed claims in Colorado, a drummer carrying cases of patent medicines. Margaret sat alone, her worn leather suitcase tucked beneath the wooden bench, her hands folded primly in her lap. She had dressed carefully that morning in her best traveling suit, a deep burgundy wool that had seen better days but still held its shape. Her graying hair was pinned neatly beneath a simple hat, and though her face showed the lines of 58 years, her blue eyes remained clear and steady. In her reticule, she carried a letter she had read so many times the creases had begun to tear. The words were burned into her memory now, but still she found herself reaching for it, touching the paper as if it were a talisman. Dear Mrs. Hale, your letter arrived as an answer to my prayers. I am a widower of 3 years, owner of a cattle ranch outside Silver Ridge. I seek a woman of good character and steady disposition to share the work and warmth of this life. Age matters little to me. I am 54 myself and past the foolishness of youth. What I value is honesty, capability, and companionship. If these words speak to your heart, I would be honored to meet you at the Silver Ridge station on the 15th of February. Respectfully, Harland Pierce. She had answered his advertisement in the Rocky Mountain News with carefully measured hope. At 58, Margaret understood that romantic love was likely behind her, but partnership, honest, practical partnership, that still seemed possible. She had been widowed for 7 years, her husband taken by pneumonia during a bitter winter in Kansas. Her 2 grown children had lives of their own now, families that had no room for an aging mother beyond dutiful holiday visits. When her son had suggested she might be more comfortable in a boarding house for widowed women in Denver, Margaret had felt something inside her recoil. She was not ready to be set aside, not yet. So when she saw Harland Pierce's advertisement, something had stirred in her chest. Not girlish excitement, but something steadier. The possibility of purpose, of being needed again. The conductor's voice rang through the car. Silver Ridge Station, 10 minutes. Margaret's heart quickened. She smoothed her skirt, checked her hat in the small mirror from her bag, and took a steadying breath. Around her, passengers began gathering their belongings. The young mother tried to soothe her crying baby while her husband wrestled their trunk from the overhead rack. First time in Silver Ridge, ma'am? The conductor asked as he passed, his weathered face kind beneath his cap. Yes, Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the flutter in her stomach. I'm meeting someone. Well, it's a good town. Small, but good people. You'll do fine. She nodded, grateful for the kindness, and turned back to the window. The landscape had changed again. Pine forests gave way to open rangeland, and in the distance she could see the clustered buildings of Silver Ridge nestled in a valley between low hills. Smoke rose from chimneys, and even from here she could see the main street laid out in orderly fashion, false-fronted buildings that proclaimed the town's aspirations toward permanence. The train began to slow, its brakes squealing against the iron wheels. Margaret stood, gripping the seat back as the car lurched. She pulled her suitcase from beneath the bench. It wasn't heavy, containing only her essential possessions and the few things she couldn't bear to leave behind. A daguerreotype of her late husband, her mother's wedding ring, a book of poetry her daughter had given her years ago. The train shuddered to a complete stop, steam hissing from the engine like a great beast settling itself to rest. Through the window, Margaret could see the platform, a simple wooden structure with a small station house painted green. Several people waited there, bundled against the cold. Her eyes scanned their faces, looking for a man who matched the description in the letter. Tall, with dark hair graying at the temples, a scar above his left eyebrow from a ranching accident. The conductor opened the door, and cold air rushed in, making Margaret catch her breath. She pulled her coat tighter and descended the metal steps carefully, her boots finding the worn wood of the platform. The altitude made her momentarily dizzy. Silver Ridge sat higher than anywhere she'd lived before. Around her, passengers dispersed, met by waiting loved ones or heading toward the station house. Margaret set down her suitcase and looked around more carefully now. A man stood near the edge of the platform, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair indeed showing gray at the temples. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat and a wide-brimmed hat, his face weathered by sun and wind. Their eyes met. Margaret felt a small smile begin to form, her hand lifting in a tentative wave. This was him. This was Harlan Pierce, the beginning of her new life. The man started walking toward her, his boots heavy on the platform boards. But as he drew closer, Margaret saw something in his face that made her smile falter. His eyes had widened, and not with pleasure. His mouth had thinned into a tight line. He was looking at her as if she were a mistake, an error that needed correcting. He stopped 3 feet away, his gaze traveling from her face down to her suitcase and back up again. The silence between them stretched taut as wire. "Mrs. Hale?" His voice was flat, carefully devoid of emotion. "Yes." Margaret lifted her chin slightly, some instinct warning her to hold her ground. "Mr. Pierce?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he looked away, toward the train, toward the station house, anywhere but at her. His jaw worked as if he were chewing words he didn't want to speak. "How old are you?" he asked finally, his tone almost accusatory. Margaret felt heat rise in her face, but she kept her voice level. "I'm 58. I stated as much in my letter to you." "I thought—" He stopped, shook his head. "I didn't realize you meant—" He didn't finish, but he didn't need to. The meaning was clear in every line of his body, every flicker of disappointment in his eyes. He had expected someone younger. Despite his words about age not mattering, despite his own 54 years, he had imagined a woman of 40, perhaps 45. Someone who could still pass for middle-aged rather than approaching elderly. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest, but she refused to let it show on her face. She had survived too much in her life to crumble now. "I apologize for the misunderstanding," she said quietly, with dignity. "If I had known—" "This won't work," Harlan interrupted, his voice gruff. "I'm sorry you came all this way, but this won't work." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather wallet, extracting several bills. "For your trouble. There's a boarding house on 3rd Street. Mrs. Kelly runs it. She's decent enough." He held out the money, not meeting her eyes. Margaret looked at the bills, then at his face. Something hot and angry flickered through her, but she pushed it down. She had her pride, and she would not beg this man, this small, disappointing man who couldn't even look her in the eye. "Keep your money," she said, her voice steady as stone. "I'll manage." "Ma'am, I insist." I said no. The words came out sharper than she intended, but she didn't soften them. "You've made your position clear, Mr. Pierce. I require nothing further from you." For the first time since he'd approached her, Harlan Pierce looked directly at her face. Something flickered in his expression, shame, perhaps, or discomfort at her refusal to accept his guilt offering. But whatever it wasn't enough to change his mind. "I'm sorry," he muttered again, and then he turned and walked away, his boots echoing on the platform boards, growing fainter with each step. Margaret stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, watching him go. The train's whistle blew, a final warning before departure. All around her, the platform was emptying. The young couple with their baby had already disappeared into town. The miners had loaded their gear into a wagon and driven off. Even the conductor had retreated into the station house. She was alone on the platform now, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the snow-dusted boards. The cold bit at her face and hands, finding its way through the wool of her coat. Her suitcase sat at her feet like an accusation. From the station house window, she could see faces watching her. The ticket agent, a woman in a blue bonnet, 2 men in rough work clothes. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to pity. The whole town would know by nightfall. The bride who was too old. The woman who had traveled 800 miles only to be rejected on the platform. Margaret felt the weight of their stares, but she didn't drop her gaze. She didn't reach for a handkerchief to dab at tears she refused to shed. Instead, she bent down, grasped the handle of her suitcase, and lifted it. She had no plan, no idea where she would sleep that night or what she would do in the morning, but she would not stand on this platform and give them the satisfaction of watching her break. She began to walk, her back straight, her head high. Each step felt like moving through deep water, but she kept going. Down the platform steps, onto the dirt road that led into town. Her suitcase grew heavier with each step, but she didn't set it down. The main street of Silver Ridge stretched before her, a rough frontier town clinging to respectability. On her right, a mercantile store with goods displayed in the window. On her left, a saloon already doing brisk business despite the early hour. Further down, she could see a church steeple, a dry goods store, a barber shop with its red and white pole. People stopped to stare as she passed. Women whispered behind gloved hands. Men tipped their hats, but their eyes held questions. She heard fragments of conversation drift past her. That's the one he rejected. All the way from Kansas, I heard. What did she expect at her age? Margaret kept walking, her eyes fixed straight ahead. The suitcase handle bit into her palm through her glove. Her arm ached, but she would not stop in the middle of the street. She would find somewhere. The boarding house Pierce had mentioned, perhaps, and she would gather herself in private. The street curved slightly, following the natural contour of the land. Ahead, she could see a building with a sign that read Kelly's Boarding House. It was 2 stories, painted white with green shutters, better maintained than many of the other structures. A porch wrapped around the front, and lace curtains hung in the windows. Margaret aimed for it like a ship making for harbor in a storm. Just a few more steps. Just a little further. "Ma'am." The voice came from her left, quiet but clear. Margaret stopped, her breath catching. She turned her head slowly. A man stood beside a wagon in front of the general store. He was tall, lean, with the weathered look of someone who spent his life outdoors. His face was angular, marked by sun and wind, and his eyes were a striking gray-green beneath the brim of a worn hat. He looked to be in his early 50s, though it was hard to tell with ranchmen. The elements aged them differently. Unlike the others who had stared with pity or judgment, this man's expression held something else. Recognition, perhaps. An understanding that made Margaret's throat tighten. "I apologize for intruding," he said, stepping away from his wagon. His voice was low and rough, like gravel underfoot, but not unkind. "But you look like you could use a hand with that case." Margaret's first instinct was to refuse, to maintain the wall of pride that had gotten her this far. But something in his face stopped her. There was no pity there, no judgment, just a simple offer of help from one person to another. "I'm Caleb Turner," he continued when she didn't immediately respond. "I have a ranch about 5 miles north of town. I was at the station earlier." He paused, and she understood what he wasn't saying. He had witnessed the entire humiliating scene with Harlan Pierce. "I can manage," Margaret said, though her aching arm told a different story. "I'm sure you can," Caleb replied. "But there's no shame in accepting help when it's freely offered." Something about the way he said it, the acknowledgement of her capability alongside the offer of assistance, made Margaret's resistance crumble slightly. She was so tired from the long journey, from the shock of rejection, from maintaining her composure under the weight of all those staring eyes. "I'm Margaret Hale," she said finally. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Hale." He moved closer and reached for the suitcase handle. "May I?" She hesitated one more moment, then released her grip. The relief in her arm was immediate and profound. "I was heading to Kelly's," she said, gesturing toward the boarding house. Caleb nodded. "It's a decent place. Mrs. Kelly's a bit stern, but fair. Though," he paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "If you're planning to stay in Silver Ridge, you should know the boarding house isn't cheap. $3 a week for room and board. $3 a week." Margaret did quick calculations in her head. She had $47 in her reticule, her entire savings from 7 years of careful scry-rimping. At $3 a week, that would last her less than 4 months. And that wasn't accounting for other necessities. Her face must have shown something of her thoughts, because Caleb cleared his throat gently. "Mrs. Hale, I have a proposition, if you'll hear it." She looked at him warily. "What kind of proposition?" "Nothing improper. he said quickly, and she could see color rising in his weathered cheeks. I have a cabin on my ranch. It's small, just 2 rooms, but it's sound and warm. I've been using it for storage since I built the main house 3 years ago. If you needed a place to stay while you figure out your next step, you'd be welcome to it. No charge. I don't accept charity, Mr. Turner. It's not charity. The place is just sitting empty. You'd actually be doing me a favor. Keeping the stove going will prevent the pipes from freezing, and it could use someone looking after it. He shifted the suitcase to his other hand. I'd also be glad to pay for help around the ranch, if you're willing. Cooking, mending, general household work. Standard wages, $1 a week plus room and board. Margaret studied his face, looking for the catch, the hidden motive. But his expression remained open, honest. This was simply a practical offer from a practical man. Why would you help me? She asked. You don't know me. Caleb was quiet for a moment, his eyes drifting toward the train station, now empty except for the station master locking up for the evening. When he looked back at her, there was something in his face that spoke of old pain, old memories. Let's just say I know what it's like when life doesn't turn out the way you planned, he said. Sometimes a person just needs a bit of breathing room to figure out the next step. The kindness in his voice was almost harder to bear than Pierce's rejection had been. Margaret felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack, and she blinked rapidly against the sudden sting in her eyes. I would need time to consider, she began. Of course. Tell you what, it's getting late and the temperature's dropping. Why don't you come out to the ranch for supper at least? Give you a chance to see the place. See if it would suit. If you decide you'd rather stay at Kelly's, I'll bring you back to town in the morning. No obligation. It was a reasonable offer, more than reasonable given her circumstances, and the thought of spending the night at the boarding house, enduring the curious stares and whispered questions, made Margaret's stomach clench. All right, she said quietly. Thank you, Mr. Turner. He nodded and carried her suitcase toward his wagon, a sturdy farm wagon with a canvas cover stretched over wooden ribs. He loaded the case into the back with surprising care, then offered his hand to help her up onto the bench seat. As the wagon pulled away from the main street of Silver Ridge, Margaret looked back at the town that had offered her nothing but rejection and whispers. Then she turned her face forward toward whatever lay ahead. The road north was rough, carved through land that showed signs of hard use. They passed several ranches, small operations with weathered fences and lean cattle. Caleb drove in silence, not forcing conversation, and Margaret was grateful for it. She needed time to think, to process what had happened, to shore up her defenses before facing whatever came next. The landscape was beautiful in its harsh way. Snow clung to the shadowed places beneath pines, and in the distance, mountains rose like gray ghosts against the darkening sky. The air smelled of wood smoke and cold earth and something wild she couldn't name. After about half an hour, Caleb turned the wagon onto a narrower track that led through a stand of pine. Not much further now, he said. They emerged from the trees into a clearing that held several buildings. The main house was modest but well built, made of logs chinked with clay and topped with a steep shingled roof. Smoke rose from the stone chimney. Near the house stood a barn, a chicken coop, a tool shed, and, set slightly apart from the others, a smaller cabin. That's the one I mentioned, Caleb said, pointing to the smaller structure. I'll get a fire going in there while you warm up in the main house. He helped her down from the wagon and led her to the main house. Inside it was simple but clean. One large room served as kitchen and living space, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A hallway led to what she assumed were bedrooms. The furniture was handmade but sturdy, a table with 2 chairs, a rocker by the fire, shelves holding books and supplies. Coffee's still warm, Caleb said, moving to the stove. Or I can make tea if you prefer. Coffee would be welcome, Margaret said, removing her gloves and coat. The warmth of the room was seeping into her bones, making her realize how cold she'd become. Caleb poured 2 cups and gestured to the table. They sat across from each other, the coffee steaming between them. Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm cup and allowed herself a moment to simply breathe. I should start the fire in the cabin, Caleb said after a moment. Make yourself comfortable. I won't be long. He left through the back door, and Margaret was alone. She sipped the coffee, strong and black, no sugar, and looked around the room. There were signs of a woman's presence once, though faded now. Lace curtains at the windows, though they were dusty. A sampler on the wall with stitching so fine it must have taken months. A woman's rocker by the fireplace, smaller than the other chair. Margaret rose and moved closer to the sampler. The stitching read, "Home is where the heart finds rest. Sarah Turner, 1885. So he had been married, and his wife was gone now. If the dust and silence meant anything. She heard the back door open and returned quickly to the table, not wanting to be caught snooping. Caleb entered, brushing snow from his shoulders. "Fire's going. Place should be warm enough in an hour or so." He moved to the stove and began pulling out ingredients. "I was planning on beans and cornbread for supper. Not fancy, but filling. You're welcome to join me, or I can bring something out to the cabin when it's ready." "I'll help with the cooking, if you'll allow it," Margaret said. The need to be useful, to contribute something, was overwhelming. "I'm a decent cook." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'd appreciate that. I never did develop much skill at it." They worked together in companionable silence. Margaret found her way around his kitchen with surprising ease, and Caleb stayed out of her way while still being helpful when needed. It was a rhythm she remembered from her marriage, two people moving around each other with practiced efficiency. The beans were already soaked and simmering, so she focused on the cornbread, mixing meal and milk and eggs into a batter, while Caleb set the table and sliced salt pork to fry. The domesticity of it was both comforting and painful, a reminder of what she'd lost and what she'd hoped to find. "You were married," Caleb said suddenly. It wasn't a question. "For 31 years, Margaret replied, stirring the batter. "He died 7 years ago. Pneumonia." Caleb was quiet, turning the pork in the pan. "My Sarah died 3 years back. Fever. By the time I got her to the doctor in Billings, it was too late." "I'm sorry." "Me too." He moved the pork to a plate and drained some of the grease. "For both of us." They ate as the sun set beyond the windows, filling the room with orange and gold light. The food was simple but good, and Margaret realized she hadn't eaten since early morning. They spoke little during the meal, but it wasn't an awkward silence. It was the quiet of two people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. After supper, Caleb helped her carry her suitcase to the cabin. Inside, it was indeed small. One room with a bed, a table, a chair, and a small stove. But it was clean, and the fire had warmed it nicely. A single window looked out toward the mountains. "There's a pump out back for water," Caleb said, setting her case on the floor. "Outhouse is behind the main house, closest one to this cabin. I'll leave you to settle in. If you need anything, just knock on my door." "Mr. Turner," Margaret said as he turned to leave, "why are you doing this?" He stopped in the doorway, his back to her. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he turned his head slightly, just enough that she could see his profile in the firelight. "Like I said, I know what it's like when life doesn't go according to plan. Sarah and we tried for years to have children. Never happened. After she died, I realized I'd spent so much time focusing on what I didn't have that I'd failed to appreciate what I did have until it was gone." He paused. "When I saw you on that platform today, standing there with your head up even though that fool Pierce had just humiliated you, I thought to myself, there's a woman who knows how to endure. Seemed to me that kind of strength deserves respect, not pity." Before Margaret could respond, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. She stood alone in the cabin, his words echoing in her mind. Slowly, she moved to the window and looked out at the darkening landscape. The mountains were silhouettes now, against a sky turning from blue to black. Stars were beginning to appear, sharp and cold and infinite. Margaret pressed her hand against the glass, feeling the chill through her palm. She had traveled 800 miles to find a new life, only to have it snatched away before it could begin. She should feel devastated, destroyed by the rejection and uncertainty. But standing in this small cabin, warmed by a fire built by a stranger's kind hands, with the taste of shared supper still on her tongue, Margaret felt something she hadn't expected. She felt possible. Tomorrow she would need to make decisions, whether to stay or return to Kansas, whether to accept Caleb's offer or strike out on her own. But tonight, she would rest in this small, warm place and allow herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, being abandoned on that train platform had not been an ending. Perhaps it had been a beginning. Outside, the wind picked up, whispering through the pines. Inside, the fire crackled and settled. And Margaret Hale, who had been called too old for a new life, unpacked her worn suitcase, and prepared for whatever the morning might bring. She was not broken. She was not defeated. She was simply beginning again. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through the cabin's single window, and Margaret woke to the unfamiliar sound of silence. No rumble of trains, no clatter of boarding house activity, no city noise bleeding through thin walls. Just the whisper of wind through pine branches and the distant lowing of cattle. She lay still for a moment, letting memory reassemble itself. The train platform. Harlan Pierce's face. Caleb Turner's unexpected kindness. This small cabin that smelled of pine smoke and old wood. The fire had died during the night, and the air held a sharp chill. Margaret rose quickly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders as she crossed the cold floor to the stove. Her fingers were stiff as she worked, building a new fire with the kindling Caleb had left stacked beside the wood box. Within minutes, small flames licked at the dry wood, and she held her hands close to the growing warmth. Through the window, she could see smoke already rising from the chimney of the main house. Caleb was awake then. She wondered what time ranch life began, certainly earlier than her own habits of recent years. She dressed carefully in a practical skirt and shirtwaist, pinning her graying hair into a neat bun. Her reflection in the small mirror showed a woman whose face was lined but not defeated, whose eyes were tired but clear. She looked at herself critically, trying to see what Harlan Pierce had seen, what had made him turn away so decisively. Too old. That's what his eyes had said. Too old for new beginnings, for companionship, for anything but gentle decline into irrelevance. Margaret set down the mirror with more force than necessary. She would not waste another moment on that man's judgment. Outside, the morning air was sharp enough to make her catch her breath. Frost covered everything, turning the ranch into something crystalline and strange. She made her way to the main house, her boots crunching on frozen ground. She knocked, and Caleb's voice called out, "It's open!" Inside, he was standing at the stove, spatula in hand, looking slightly harassed. The smell of burning filled the air. "Morning," he said, scraping determinedly at whatever was in the pan. "I was attempting eggs. Not successfully." Despite everything, Margaret felt a smile tug at her lips. "May I?" He stepped aside gratefully, handing her the spatula. The eggs were indeed a disaster, scorched at the edges, runny in the middle. She scraped them onto a plate and set them aside, then reached for the egg basket on the counter. "Start fresh," she said, cracking new eggs into the pan. "Lower heat this time." They fell into the same easy rhythm as the night before. Caleb sliced bread while she cooked eggs and fried potatoes. He set the table while she made coffee. Neither spoke much, but the silence felt comfortable, like a worn coat that fit just right. When they sat down to eat, Caleb cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about what I offered yesterday, about you staying on, helping around the ranch. I don't want you to feel obligated just because I gave you a place to sleep last night." Margaret set down her fork carefully. "I don't feel obligated, but I do need to understand what you're proposing. You mentioned $1 a week plus room and board for household work." "That's right. Cooking, mending, general housekeeping. I'm not much good at any of it, and the place has gotten away from me since Sarah died." He gestured around the room, and Margaret noticed what she'd been too tired to see clearly the night before. Dust on the shelves, cobwebs in the corners, mending piled in a basket by the rocker. "I spend most of my time with the cattle and horses. The house gets what's left over, which isn't much." "And the cabin would be mine to use? Separate quarters?" "Completely separate. I wouldn't expect—" He stopped, color rising in his weathered face. "It would be a business arrangement, Mrs. Hale. Nothing improper." She appreciated his directness. "How long would you need help?" "For as long as you're willing to stay." He met her eyes steadily. "But I understand if you want to head back to Kansas. This must have been an awful shock, what happened yesterday. If you need money for the train fare—" "I'm not going back to Kansas," Margaret said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "There's nothing for me there. My son made that clear when he suggested the boarding house." Something flickered across Caleb's face. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition. Family can be complicated. That's a diplomatic way of putting it. She picked up her coffee cup, wrapping her hands around its warmth. "My children are good people, but they have their own lives. I'm a duty to them now, not a necessity. I won't be a burden." "You don't strike me as someone who'd be a burden anywhere." The simple statement, delivered without flattery or pity, made Margaret's throat tighten. She took a sip of coffee to cover the emotion. "I'll stay," she said. "For now, at least. Through the spring, if that suits you. It will give me time to figure out what comes next." Caleb nodded, and she thought she saw relief in his eyes. "Fair enough. We can see how it goes, make adjustments if needed." "I'll earn my keep, Mr. Turner. You won't regret this." "I don't doubt that. And it's Caleb. We're going to be living on the same ranch. Might as well use first names." "Then you should call me Margaret." They shook hands across the table, sealing the agreement. His grip was firm and calloused, the hand of a man who worked with rope and leather and wood. When he released her hand, Margaret felt something settle inside her. Not quite hope, but something steadier. Purpose, perhaps. After breakfast, Caleb showed her around the ranch properly. The barn held 6 horses, including a gentle mare named Bess that he said Margaret could ride if she was so inclined. The chicken coop housed 24 hens that provided eggs and the occasional rooster for the pot. Behind the main house, a root cellar was stocked with potatoes, turnips, and jars of preserves that Sarah had put up years ago. "I keep meaning to use these," Caleb said, holding up a jar of peach preserves. "But they were hers, and He stopped, setting the jar back carefully. "Well, foolishness, I suppose." "It's not foolish," Margaret said gently. "The things we leave behind are all that's left of us." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw understanding pass between them. They were both people who had loved and lost, who carried ghosts in their daily lives. The ranch itself was modest, about 200 acres with 60 head of cattle, Caleb explained. He ran a few beef cattle for market and kept some dairy cows for milk and butter. The land wasn't rich, but it was his, bought with money he'd saved working other people's ranches for 20 years. "Sarah and I came here 5 years ago," he said as they walked back toward the house. "Built the main house that first summer. She loved this place, said it felt like starting fresh." "Do you have family?" Margaret asked. "A sister back in Ohio. We write once a year at Christmas. My parents passed some time ago." He kicked at a frozen clod of dirt. "What about you? You mentioned a son." "2 children. Robert is in Denver, managing a dry goods store. My daughter Elizabeth married a banker in Topeka." Margaret kept her voice neutral, but something must have shown in her face because Caleb glanced at her sharply. "They know you're here." "They know I answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride." Robert was horrified. "Elizabeth said I was being foolish at my age." The words still stung, even in the retelling. "They both made it clear they thought I should accept my lot. A quiet room somewhere, knitting and waiting for death, I suppose." "That doesn't sound like much of a life." "No," Margaret agreed. "It doesn't." They had reached the main house again. Caleb paused at the door, his hand on the latch. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're foolish. Brave, maybe, but not foolish." The rest of that first week passed in a rhythm of work and discovery. Margaret cleaned the main house from top to bottom, washing windows and scrubbing floors and beating dust from curtains that hadn't been touched in years. She cooked meals that were simple but substantial, the kind of food a working man needed. She mended shirts with elbows worn through and darned socks that had more holes than fabric. Caleb, for his part, gave her space while remaining nearby if she needed anything. He was out with the cattle most days, checking the herd and mending fence lines, but he always returned for the midday meals she prepared, and they ate together at the kitchen table, trading small observations about their day. "Found wolf tracks by the north pasture," he might say. "The bread didn't rise properly. I think the yeast might be old," she would reply. Ordinary conversations, the kind that meant nothing and everything. The sound of another human voice. The acknowledgement that you were not alone. On Saturday, Caleb drove into town for supplies, and Margaret went with him. She needed fabric for new curtains and thread for mending. As the wagon rolled down the main street of Silver Ridge, Margaret felt eyes follow them, the same curious, judging eyes that had watched her arrive a week ago. At the general store, the proprietor's wife, a stern woman named Mrs. Cassidy, looked between them with barely concealed speculation. "Mrs. Hale," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I heard you were staying out at the Turner Ranch. How convenient for you both." Margaret felt her spine stiffen, but before she could respond, Caleb spoke up. "Mrs. Hale is my housekeeper."
he said evenly. She's been a great help getting the place in order. You should see how clean my kitchen is now. Sarah would be pleased. The invocation of his dead wife's name seemed to take some of the wind from Mrs. Cassidy's sails. She sniffed and turned her attention to measuring out the fabric Margaret had requested. Outside, as they loaded the supplies into the wagon, Margaret said quietly, "Thank you for that." Caleb shrugged. "People will talk no matter what we do. Might as well give them the truth to chew on." But the encounter left Margaret unsettled. She hadn't considered how their arrangement might look to outsiders. A widowed man and a widowed woman living on the same property, even if in separate quarters. In a small town like Silver Ridge, such things mattered. That evening, as she prepared supper in the main house, she brought it up. "Caleb, I don't want to damage your reputation. If people are talking, let them talk." He was sitting at the table, cleaning his rifle, a weekly ritual she'd learned. "I know what this is. You know what this is. That's what matters." "But in a town like this, Margaret," he set down the cleaning rod and looked at her directly. "I spent 3 years in this house alone, and not one person from town came out to check on me or offer help. But you show up, and suddenly everyone's concerned about propriety." His voice held an edge she hadn't heard before. "I don't much care what they think." She turned back to the stove, stirring the stew that bubbled there. His words should have reassured her, but they didn't. She knew how small towns worked, how quickly reputation could be destroyed by whispers and speculation. The following Sunday, Margaret surprised herself by suggesting they attend the community gathering at the church. Caleb looked skeptical. "You sure about that? After what happened with Pierce, and now with people talking?" "If I hide out here, it only makes the gossip worse," Margaret said, smoothing her best dress. "Better to face them head on." The church in Silver Ridge was a simple white building with a modest steeple. When they arrived, people were already gathering, families in their Sunday best, children chasing each other between the wagons. Conversations died as Margaret and Caleb approached. Inside, they found seats near the back. Margaret kept her head high, nodding politely to those who met her eyes and ignoring those who didn't. Beside her, Caleb sat rigid, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. After the service, there was a social gathering in the adjacent hall. Tables groaned under the weight of food brought by the townswomen, pies and cakes, fried chicken and biscuits, preserves and fresh bread. It was meant to be welcoming, but Margaret felt the undercurrent of judgment in every glance. She was standing near the refreshment table when a woman approached, younger than Margaret, perhaps 45, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. "Mrs. Hale, I'm Ruth Brennan. I run the boarding house 2 doors down from Kelly's." Margaret braced herself for criticism, but Ruth's smile seemed genuine. "I wanted to welcome you properly to Silver Ridge. I heard about what happened with Harlan Pierce, and I want you to know not all of us are like that. He's a fool, if you ask me." The unexpected kindness made Margaret's eyes prickle. "Thank you. That's very generous." "Not generous, just honest. I've known Harlan for 10 years, and he's always been more concerned with appearances than substance." Ruth leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "For what it's worth, I think Caleb Turner is a good man. If he's offered you employment, you're fortunate. He's fair and decent, which is more than can be said for some around here." Before Margaret could respond, another woman joined them, Mrs. Cassidy from the general store, flanked by 2 others who looked like they'd been cut from the same disapproving cloth. "Mrs. Hale," Mrs. Cassidy said, her tones syrupy, "we were just discussing how unusual your situation is. Living out at the Turner Ranch, unchaperoned. In our day, a woman wouldn't dream of such an arrangement." "In your day," Ruth Brennan interjected smoothly, "women had more options. Mrs. Hale is working as a housekeeper. There's nothing scandalous about honest employment." Mrs. Cassidy's eyes narrowed. "Still, it seems like a practical arrangement between 2 adults who have both suffered loss," Ruth continued, her voice firm. "Unless you'd like to offer Mrs. Hale a position in your household, I'm sure she'd welcome the work." Mrs. Cassidy's face reddened. "Well, I never suggested—" "No, you never do suggest anything helpful, do you? Just criticism." Ruth turned to Margaret with a warm smile. "Don't let these old hens ruffle your feathers. You're doing just fine." As Mrs. Cassidy and her companions retreated in a huff, Margaret felt a rush of gratitude. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did. I can't stand bullies, and that's what they are."
Ruth glanced across the room to where Caleb stood talking with a group of ranchers. Caleb's been alone too long. It's good for him to have company. And from what I can see, you carry yourself like a woman who knows her own worth. That's something to be proud of. The interaction with Ruth Brennan became a turning point. Over the following weeks, Margaret found an unexpected ally. Ruth stopped by the ranch occasionally, bringing fresh bread or eggs and staying for coffee. She was blunt and practical, with a dry sense of humor that made Margaret laugh, something she hadn't done much of lately. Through Ruth, Margaret learned more about Silver Ridge and its inhabitants. Harlan Pierce, it turned out, had advertised for a mail-order bride 3 times in the past 2 years, rejecting each woman who'd answered. The town was beginning to see him for what he was, a man too concerned with appearances to recognize genuine value. "He'll die alone," Ruth said matter-of-factly one afternoon as they sat in Margaret's cabin sharing tea. "And he'll have no one to blame but himself." "I should feel sorry for him," Margaret said, "but I can't quite manage it." "Why should you? He humiliated you publicly and left you stranded. The fact that you've landed on your feet is a credit to you, not him." February gave way to March, and the ranch began to show signs of spring. Snow retreated from the southern slopes, revealing brown grass that would soon turn green. The cattle grew restless, and Caleb spent long days riding the fence lines, preparing for the spring work ahead. Margaret had settled into her role with surprising ease. The work was hard but satisfying, tangible in a way her life in Kansas had not been toward the end. Here, she could see the results of her labor: a clean kitchen, mended clothes, meals that brought a look of appreciation to Caleb's weathered face. One evening in late March, as they sat by the fire after supper, Caleb cleared his throat in the way he did when he had something difficult to say. "There's a dance in town next Saturday," he said, not looking at her. "Spring social. I was thinking, if you wanted, we could go. Together." Margaret set down her mending, startled. "Together?" "As friends," he added quickly. "Not as, I just thought—" He stopped, looking flustered. "Hell, I'm making a mess of this. You've been cooped up on this ranch for weeks. Might be nice to have an evening out, and I'd be glad for the company, that's all." She studied his face, seeing the sincerity there beneath the awkwardness. A dance. In front of the whole town. It would certainly give the gossips something to talk about. "All right," she said. "I'd like that." The relief in his expression was almost comical. "Good. That's good." They didn't speak of it again that week, but Margaret found herself thinking about it more than she wanted to admit. She'd been to barn dances back in Kansas years ago when she was young and Charles was still alive. She'd loved dancing, the freedom of movement, the music that filled your body and made you forget everything else. But that was a lifetime ago. What would it be like now, at 58, taking to the floor with a man who was still essentially a stranger, despite the weeks they'd spent living in proximity? Saturday arrived with clear skies and unseasonably warm weather. Margaret spent the afternoon agonizing over what to wear. Her wardrobe was limited, practical clothes for housework, nothing fancy. Finally, she chose her best dress, a deep green wool that brought out the color of her eyes. She pinned her hair carefully and even added a small cameo brooch that had been her mother's. When she emerged from the cabin, Caleb was waiting by the wagon. He'd cleaned up too, she noticed. Fresh shirt, hair combed, beard trimmed. He looked younger somehow, less weathered. His eyes widened slightly when he saw her. "You look very nice." "Thank you. So do you." The drive into town was quiet, but not uncomfortably so. Margaret watched the landscape roll by, the mountains turning pink and gold in the evening light. She felt nervous in a way she hadn't felt in decades, a fluttering in her stomach that was both unsettling and strangely pleasant. The dance was being held in the town hall, a large building that served multiple purposes. Already music spilled out into the street, a fiddle and banjo creating lively tunes that made toes tap. People streamed toward the entrance, dressed in their finest. Caleb helped her down from the wagon, and they walked toward the hall together. Margaret felt eyes turn toward them, saw conversations pause mid-sentence. Beside her, Caleb's jaw tightened, but he kept walking. Inside, the hall had been transformed. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting warm light over the crowd. Long tables held refreshments, punch and cookies and sandwiches. At one end, the musicians played on a makeshift stage. In the center, couples already whirled across the floor. Would you like some punch? Caleb asked. Before Margaret could answer, Harlan Pierce materialized in front of them. He looked uncomfortable, his collar too tight, his expression pinched. Turner, he said with a curt nod. His eyes flicked to Margaret and away again, as if looking at her pained him. Pierce. Caleb's voice was cool. An awkward silence descended. Margaret felt her heart beating hard against her ribs. This was the first time she'd seen her mail-order groom since that day on the platform. Mrs. Hale, Harlan said finally, the words forced. I hope you're settling in. I am, Margaret said, her voice steady. Thank you for your concern. He shifted his weight, clearly wanting to escape but trapped by some sense of obligation. I wanted to say, what happened at the station? I may have been hasty. Hasty? Margaret repeated the word as if tasting it. Is that what you call it? Harlan's face reddened. I just meant, look, maybe we could talk. Start over. I've reconsidered and perhaps... No, Margaret said simply. He blinked. I'm sorry? I said no. I'm not interested in reconsidering anything with you, Mr. Pierce. You made yourself perfectly clear on the platform that day. I'm content with the life I've found since. She felt Caleb shift beside her, standing just slightly closer. Not protectively, exactly, but in solidarity. Harlan's expression hardened. I see. Well, I suppose Turner here is a step up from nothing. That's enough, Caleb said, his voice quiet but dangerous. Is it? Everyone in town knows she's living at your ranch, Turner. Makes a man wonder what kind of arrangement you've really got out there. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Margaret felt heat flood her face, but before she could speak, Caleb stepped forward. You need to walk away now, Pierce. Before you say something you'll regret. For a moment, the two men faced each other, and Margaret feared violence might erupt right there in the middle of the dance. But Harlan must have seen something in Caleb's eyes that gave him pause. He stepped back, adjusting his collar. This town will talk, he said. You can't stop that. Let them, Caleb replied. Now move along. Harlan left, disappearing into the crowd. Margaret released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. I'm sorry, Caleb said, turning to her. I shouldn't have brought you here. I didn't think... Don't apologize, Margaret interrupted. You have nothing to apologize for. He's the one who should be ashamed. But the encounter had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. She could feel eyes on them now, could hear the whispers starting. The whole town would know about the confrontation by tomorrow. Do you want to leave? Caleb asked quietly. Margaret looked around the hall, at the dancers enjoying themselves, at the families laughing together, at all the ordinary joy she had thought she might find here. Then she looked at Caleb, this decent man who had shown her kindness when he owed her nothing. No, she said firmly. I want to dance. Surprise flickered across his face, followed by something that might have been admiration. He offered his arm. Then let's dance. They moved onto the floor as a waltz began, joining the other couples already swaying to the music. Caleb's hand settled at her waist, and Margaret placed her hand on his shoulder. They began to move together, and though their steps weren't perfectly matched at first, they found their rhythm quickly. Margaret was acutely aware of the stares, the whispers. But as they turned across the floor, something else began to happen. Other couples made space for them. Ruth Brennan, dancing with her husband, caught Margaret's eye and smiled encouragingly. Even some who had been openly skeptical seemed to soften as they watched two people simply enjoying a dance. You're good at this, Caleb said, his voice low. So are you. Sarah taught you? She tried. I was never much good at it, but she loved dancing. A shadow crossed his face. I should have done it more often when I had the chance. The waltz ended and a livelier tune began. They danced 3 more dances, neither speaking much, just moving together in a way that felt natural despite the short time they'd known each other. Margaret's cheeks flushed with exertion, and she realized she was smiling, truly smiling, for the first time since arriving in Silver Ridge. When they finally stepped off the floor to get punch, Margaret felt lighter than she had in years. The whispers continued, but they seemed to matter less now. As they stood by the refreshment table, catching their breath, Margaret noticed something. Harlan Pierce stood alone near the door, watching them with an expression that might have been regret. But when he caught her looking, he turned away sharply and left the hall. Good riddance, Caleb muttered. Margaret sipped her punch, watching couples whirl past. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the hope with which she'd boarded that train, the devastation of rejection, the unexpected kindness that had followed. Life was strange in how it unfolded. You thought you knew where you were going, and then everything changed in an instant. Thank you for bringing me tonight, she said to Caleb. Thank you for coming with me and for not backing down from Pierce or anyone else. They looked at each other, and something passed between them. An understanding, a recognition of each other as people who had survived loss and disappointment and were still standing. The music swelled around them, and Caleb offered his hand again. One more dance? Margaret took it. One more. They moved back onto the floor, and this time when people watched, Margaret didn't care. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not where she'd planned to end up, but where she'd needed to be all along. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but the silence felt different now, fuller somehow, weighted with things unsaid. Margaret watched the moonlit landscape roll past, her body still humming with the memory of music and movement. Beside her, Caleb held the reins loosely, his profile sharp against the star-scattered sky. "You're smiling," he said suddenly. Margaret hadn't realized she was. "I suppose I am. I'd forgotten what it feels like to dance." "Me too." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Sarah would have liked you. She always said the strongest people are the ones who keep standing when they have every reason to fall." The comment settled over Margaret like a blanket. "I'd like to have known her. She was stubborn as a mule and twice as hard-headed." Caleb's voice held affection rather than criticism. "Once she got an idea in her head, there was no talking her out of it. When we first came here, everyone said this land was too rough, the winters too hard. She just smiled and started building." Margaret understood the ache in his words, the particular loneliness of loving someone who was gone but not forgotten. "My Charles was like that too, stubborn. He believed in impossible things and somehow made them real through sheer determination." They fell silent again, but it was a companionable silence now, the kind shared by people who had survived similar storms. When they reached the ranch, Caleb helped her down from the wagon. His hands were warm through the fabric of her dress, and for a moment they stood close enough that Margaret could smell the clean scent of soap and leather that seemed to surround him. "Thank you for tonight," she said, "for all of it." "You made it easy." He stepped back, creating proper distance between them. "Sleep well, Margaret." "You too, Caleb." She walked to her cabin, aware of his eyes following her until she reached the door. Inside, she lit the lamp and sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers moving to unpin her hair. In the small mirror, she studied her reflection, cheeks still flushed, eyes bright. She looked alive in a way she hadn't in years. The next 2 weeks passed with the steady rhythm of ranch life. April arrived with warmer days and sudden storms that turned the roads to mud. Margaret tended the kitchen garden, coaxing seeds into the still cold earth. She scrubbed and sewed and cooked, her hands finding purpose in the endless small tasks that kept a household running. Caleb was busy with spring work, branding calves, mending fences damaged by winter storms, moving the herd to better grazing. He often came in for meals covered in dust and exhaustion, but he always found time to ask about her day, to share small observations about the ranch. "Found the first wildflowers by the creek," he might say. "The bread rose perfectly today," she would reply. Simple exchanges, but they wove themselves into something larger, a tapestry of shared days that felt increasingly precious. Ruth Brennan continued her visits, arriving unannounced with news from town or a basket of early rhubarb from her garden. She had become a true friend, the kind who didn't need pretense or careful words. "People are talking less," Ruth announced one afternoon, settling into the chair by Margaret's stove. "About you and Caleb, I mean. I think the dance helped. They saw two respectable people enjoying an evening, nothing scandalous." "I'm glad to hear it." Margaret poured coffee into 2 cups, "though I'm trying not to care what they think." Good philosophy, though easier said than done in a town this size. Ruth accepted the cup with a nod of thanks. "Still, you've handled it better than most would. Coming here as a mail-order bride, getting rejected publicly, and then landing on your feet, that takes strength." Margaret sat across from her friend, cradling her own cup. "I'm not sure it was strength. more like stubbornness. I refused to give up just because one foolish man couldn't see past his own narrow expectations. Well, whatever you call it, it's working. Ruth leaned forward conspiratorially. And speaking of foolish men, Harlan Pierce tried to place another advertisement last week. The newspaper editor refused to run it, said Pierce had developed a reputation for wasting women's time, and the paper wouldn't be party to it anymore. Margaret felt a small, uncharitable spark of satisfaction. He brought that on himself. That he did. Meanwhile, you're building a decent life here. I'd say you came out ahead in that exchange. After Ruth left, Margaret stood at her cabin window, looking out at the ranch spread before her. The land was beginning to green up, wildflowers dotting the meadows with splashes of color. Caleb was somewhere out there with the cattle, doing the endless work that kept this place running. She thought about Ruth's words, about building a decent life. Was that what she was doing? Or was she just marking time, waiting for the next chapter to begin? The question troubled her through the rest of the afternoon and into the evening. When Caleb came in for supper, she found herself watching him more closely than usual, the way he moved through the kitchen with growing familiarity, the ease with which they worked around each other now. Somewhere along the way, this had stopped feeling like a temporary arrangement and started feeling like something else, something that both comforted and unsettled her. 3 days later, a storm rolled in from the north with startling speed. Margaret was in the main house preparing supper when the first drops hit the windows. Within minutes, rain was falling in sheets, and thunder cracked overhead like rifle shots. Caleb burst through the door, soaked to the skin. Storm came up fast. I need to check the horses, make sure the barn's secure. I'll come with you, Margaret said, already reaching for her shawl. No need. Stay dry. I'll be back soon. But before he could leave again, a knock sounded at the door, loud and insistent even over the roar of the storm. Caleb opened it to reveal a man Margaret had never seen before. He was perhaps 40, with a rough beard and eyes that darted nervously. His horse stood behind him, head down against the driving rain. Sorry to intrude, the man said, water streaming from his hat. My horse threw a shoe about a mile back. Can't go further in this weather. I saw your light and hoped— Come in, Caleb said, stepping aside. But Margaret noticed the subtle way his hand moved toward the rifle that hung above the doorframe. You're welcome to wait out the storm. The stranger entered, bringing the smell of wet leather and something else, something sharp and acrid that made Margaret's nose wrinkle. Sweat, perhaps, or fear. Name's Rufus Doyle, the man said, removing his hat. His eyes swept the room, taking in details with an intensity that set Margaret's nerves on edge. Much obliged for the hospitality. Caleb Turner, this is my housekeeper, Mrs. Hale. Caleb gestured toward the stove. Coffee's on. You can dry off by the fire. Rufus moved toward the warmth, but his gaze kept returning to various objects around the room, the rifle above the door, the strongbox on the shelf where Caleb kept ranch money, Margaret's reticule hanging on its peg. You live out here alone? Rufus asked, accepting the coffee Margaret offered. Just the two of you? We manage, Caleb said, his tone neutral but his posture alert. Margaret recognized the subtle shift. He'd positioned himself between her and the stranger. Must get lonely. Rufus sipped the coffee, his eyes never still. Long way from town. No neighbors close by. We prefer the quiet, Margaret said, moving to the stove to stir the stew that bubbled there. Her heart was beating faster than it should, some instinct warning her that this man was not what he claimed to be. The storm intensified, rain hammering the roof like fists. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room in stark white bursts. In one of those flashes, Margaret caught Rufus staring at the strongbox again, and her blood went cold. Quite a storm, Rufus said, setting down his cup. Might need to stay the night if it doesn't let up. There's a bunkhouse, Caleb said. It's basic, but it's dry. No need for that. I'll just— Rufus stood abruptly, his hand moving toward his belt. But Caleb was faster. In one smooth motion, he'd crossed the room and positioned himself between Rufus and the rifle. You can sit back down, Caleb said quietly, or you can leave. Your choice. Rufus's face hardened. That's not very hospitable. I'm plenty hospitable to honest travelers, but you're not that, are you? The words hung in the air like the charge before lightning. Margaret's hand moved slowly toward the drawer where she'd placed her father's old revolver weeks ago. a precaution she'd thought excessive at the time. I don't know what you mean, Rufus said, but his stance had shifted, become predatory. I mean, you've been casing this house since you walked in, Caleb replied, his voice steady. Looking at the rifle, the strong box, my housekeeper's belongings. I've seen your type before. Men who look for isolated ranches, wait for storms, then claim their horse needs help. Rufus's expression twisted into something ugly. Clever man, but not clever enough. He lunged suddenly. Not for the rifle, but for Margaret, clearly thinking to use her as leverage. But Margaret had already opened the drawer, her fingers closing around the cold metal of the revolver. She drew it smoothly, cocking the hammer with a click that stopped Rufus in his tracks. Take one more step toward me, she said, her voice eerily calm. And I'll put a hole in you that no doctor can fix. Rufus froze, his eyes widening as he stared down the barrel of the gun. The weapon was old but well-maintained, and Margaret held it with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. Margaret, Caleb started. I've got him, she said, not taking her eyes off Rufus. My father taught me to shoot when I was 12. I'm a bit rusty, but at this distance, I won't miss. Caleb moved carefully to retrieve his own rifle, keeping Rufus in his peripheral vision. Once armed, he nodded to Margaret. You can lower yours now. I'm comfortable where I am, Margaret replied. Rufus raised his hand slowly. Now hold on, there's no need for this. I was just planning to rob us, Caleb finished. Maybe worse. The question is what we do about it now. Let me go, Rufus said quickly. I'll ride out, no trouble. You'll never see me again. In this storm? Caleb shook his head. That's a death sentence, and I'm not a murderer. Then what? Rufus's eyes darted between them. Margaret and Caleb exchanged glances. In that moment, Margaret saw the calculation in his eyes, the same careful assessment she was making. They couldn't trust this man, but they couldn't send him to his death either. The bunkhouse, Caleb said finally. You'll spend the night there. I'll lock you in and stand guard. In the morning, when the storm passes, you ride out and don't come back. Rufus's jaw clenched. And if I don't agree? Then Mrs. Hale will shoot you, and I'll bury you behind the barn. Caleb's tone was conversational, almost pleasant. Your choice. For a long moment, Rufus seemed to consider his options. Then his shoulders slumped. The bunkhouse it is. Caleb gestured toward the door with his rifle. After you, and move slow. As Rufus reached the door, he turned back to look at Margaret, still holding her revolver steady. You would have done it, wouldn't you? Shot me. Without hesitation, Margaret said truthfully. I've worked too hard to build a life here to let someone like you destroy it. Something flickered in Rufus's eyes, respect perhaps, or fear. Then Caleb prodded him through the door and out into the storm. Margaret remained standing, the revolver still in her hand, listening to their footsteps fade toward the bunkhouse. The rain continued its assault on the roof, and thunder rolled across the sky like distant drums. Her hand was shaking now, she realized. The adrenaline that had kept her steady was draining away, leaving her weak-kneed and trembling. She set the revolver carefully on the table and sank into the nearest chair. Long minutes passed. The storm raged outside, and Margaret sat in the warm kitchen, her mind replaying those tense moments when everything could have gone terribly wrong. She had been prepared to shoot that man. The realization should have horrified her, but instead she felt only a fierce satisfaction. She would protect what was hers. This life, this place, this unexpected sanctuary, she would defend it. The door opened and Caleb entered, water streaming from his coat. He secured the door behind him and set his rifle back above the frame before turning to her. He's locked in. I put a board across the door and wedged it tight. He won't get out until I let him out. Caleb moved to the stove, pouring himself coffee with hands that Margaret noticed were not quite steady either. You all right? I think so. You? Been better. He sat across from her, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. That was quick thinking, with the gun. I'm sorry I didn't mention I had it. I brought it from Kansas, kept it in the cabin. After what happened with Pierce, I thought it couldn't hurt to have protection close by. Don't apologize. I'm damn glad you had it. Caleb met her eyes. You saved us both back there. I was too far from my rifle, and he was fast. If you hadn't drawn on him, but I did. Margaret reached across the table, placing her hand over his. We handled it together. His hand turned beneath hers, his fingers closing around hers briefly before he pulled away, standing abruptly. I should eat something. Keep my strength up for watching him tonight. Margaret rose as well, moving to ladle stew into a bowl. The moment of connection had passed, but its echo remained in the suddenly charged air between them. They ate in silence, the storm providing a constant backdrop of sound. When Caleb finished, he gathered blankets and prepared to spend the night in the barn where he could watch the bunkhouse door. "I'll be fine," he said when Margaret protested. "I've spent plenty of nights in the barn. You lock yourself in here. Keep that revolver close. If anything happens, anything at all, you fire a shot and I'll come running." "Be careful," Margaret said. He paused at the door, looking back at her. The lamplight cast his face in sharp relief, highlighting the strong bones and weathered skin. "You too. And Margaret? What you did tonight, that took courage. Real courage. I won't forget it." Then he was gone into the storm, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts and the echo of his words. She cleaned up the supper dishes mechanically, her mind elsewhere. The kitchen felt too empty, too quiet despite the storm. She found herself listening for sounds from the bunkhouse, from the barn, straining to hear anything over the rain. Finally, she retreated to her cabin, locking the door securely behind her. She placed the revolver on the small table beside her bed and lay down fully clothed, knowing sleep would be impossible. The storm gradually diminished, the rain softening from a roar to a whisper. Through her window, Margaret could see a faint glow from the barn, Caleb's lantern, burning steadily through the night. She must have dozed despite herself because she woke to gray dawn light and the sound of voices outside. Margaret rose quickly, grabbing the revolver as she moved to the window. Caleb stood by the bunkhouse door, his rifle trained on Rufus, who sat astride his horse. Even from a distance, Margaret could see the defeated slump of the man's shoulders. "You ride south," Caleb was saying, his voice carrying in the still morning air. "Don't stop in Silver Ridge. Don't come back this way. If I ever see you again, I won't be so generous." Rufus nodded, not meeting Caleb's eyes. He turned his horse and rode away, moving slowly down the muddy track that led to the main road. Caleb stood watching until horse and rider disappeared from sight. Only then did he lower his rifle and turn toward the main house. Margaret met him at the door with hot coffee and a plate of biscuits left from the previous day. "He's gone," Caleb said, sinking into a chair. He looked exhausted, his eyes red-rimmed and his clothes rumpled from a night spent in the barn. "Good riddance." "Did he say anything?" "Not much. Claims he was just passing through, meant no harm. But I saw his eyes when he looked at that strongbox. He knew exactly what he was planning." Caleb accepted the coffee gratefully. "We were lucky. Things could have gone a lot worse." Margaret sat across from him, studying the lines of fatigue in his face. "You should rest today. I can handle the feeding and the other chores." "I'm fine." "You're exhausted and stubborn." She softened the words with a small smile. "Please, Caleb, let me help." He looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. "All right, but wake me if anything needs doing that you can't manage alone." "I will." He went to his room, and within minutes Margaret heard the creak of bed springs as he lay down. She moved quietly through the house, tidying and cleaning, her mind still processing the events of the previous night. She had held a gun on a man, had been prepared to shoot him if necessary. The Margaret who had stepped off that train 6 weeks ago would have been horrified. But the Margaret she was becoming understood that survival sometimes required hardness, required the willingness to defend what mattered. And this place mattered, this life she was building, one quiet day at a time. Around midday, Ruth Brennan's wagon appeared on the road. Margaret went out to meet her, grateful for the company. "I was worried about you," Ruth said, climbing down from the seat. "That was quite a storm last night. Everything all right out here?" Margaret hesitated, then decided Ruth deserved the truth. They walked to the main house, and over coffee, Margaret told her everything. Rufus Doyle's arrival, the tense confrontation, the night spent with him locked in the bunkhouse. Ruth listened with wide eyes, her cup forgotten in her hands. "You drew a gun on him?" "I did what was necessary." "And Caleb, he stood guard all night." "He did." Ruth set down her cup carefully. "Margaret, do you understand what this means? That man protected you. You protected him. That's not just a business arrangement anymore." "We're friends," Margaret said carefully. "Are you?" Ruth's eyes were knowing. "Or is it something more?"
Margaret looked away, uncomfortable with the question. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. I've seen how you are together, the way you move around each other, like you've been doing it for years, the way he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. Ruth leaned forward. The way you look at him. Ruth, I'm not judging. I'm simply observing. You're both adults who've been alone too long. There's no shame in finding companionship again. There's nothing improper happening. I didn't say there was, but Margaret, life is short. Sarah Turner died at 43. My first husband was killed by a falling tree when he was 35. We don't know how much time we have. If there's a chance at happiness, even late in life, shouldn't we take it? The word struck something deep in Margaret's chest. She thought of Caleb's words the night before, about courage. Was it courageous to open herself to the possibility of connection again, or was it foolish? I'm 58 years old, Margaret said quietly, past the age for romantic notions. Who says? Ruth's voice was fierce. Who decided there's an age limit on feeling alive, on wanting companionship, on loving and being loved? Society? A bunch of gossiping biddies who can't imagine life beyond their narrow expectations? Margaret didn't answer, but Ruth's words lodged themselves in her heart like splinters. After Ruth left, Margaret found herself thinking about Caleb in ways she'd been carefully avoiding. The strength in his weathered hands, the kindness in his gray-green eyes, the way he'd stood guard all night to protect her from danger. When he emerged from his room in late afternoon, looking more rested, she had supper ready, venison stew and fresh bread, simple but nourishing. They ate together as usual, but the silence felt different now, charged with awareness, with questions neither of them was ready to ask. Thank you, Caleb said finally, for handling things today, for everything. You don't need to thank me. This is my home too now. The words surprised her, but once spoken, she realized their truth. Somewhere along the way, this ranch had stopped being temporary refuge and become home. Caleb's eyes met hers across the table. Is it? Your home? If you'll let it be. Margaret, he stopped, seemed to struggle with words. When I asked you to stay, I thought it would be temporary. A few months, maybe, until you figured out your next step. But having you here, seeing how you've made this place, he gestured around the kitchen, now clean and welcoming in ways it hadn't been in years. It feels like a home again, like life, not just existing. Her heart was beating too fast, and she didn't trust herself to speak. What I'm trying to say, Caleb continued, his voice rough, is that I'd like you to stay. Not as temporary help, as part of this place. Permanently, if you're willing. As your housekeeper? As whatever you want to be. He stood abruptly, moving to the window. I know I'm not offering much. Just a rough ranch and a man who spent too many years alone. But it's honest work and a decent life. And if you wanted... Margaret stood as well, moving to stand beside him. Outside, the last light was fading from the sky, turning the world to shadows and silver. I want to stay, she said simply. For as long as you'll have me. Caleb turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw relief and something deeper, something that made her breath catch. Then stay, he said. Please. They stood there in the gathering darkness, not touching but close enough that Margaret could feel the warmth of him. Outside, the first stars were appearing, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the night. This was not the life she had imagined when she'd answered Harlan Pierce's advertisement. It was something entirely different, quieter perhaps, but deeper. Built not on promises of romance, but on shared strength, mutual respect, and the slow flowering of something that felt remarkably like belonging. The days that followed carried a new quality, as if the air itself had changed. Margaret moved through her tasks with the same efficiency, but now there was an undercurrent of awareness that colored everything. The way Caleb's hand brushed hers when he passed her the coffee pot, the sound of his boots on the porch when he returned from the pastures, the quiet moments when they sat together in the evening and conversation seemed less necessary than simply being in the same room. Spring deepened into early May, and the ranch came alive with color and sound. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in waves of purple and gold. The creek ran high with snowmelt from the mountains, its voice a constant rushing whisper. Calves grew stronger on their mother's milk, and the chickens laid eggs with renewed enthusiasm.
Margaret found herself settling into the rhythm of the land in ways she'd never experienced in Kansas. There, life had been measured by clock and calendar, by social obligations and town schedules. Here, time moved differently, marked by the sun's arc across the sky, by the needs of animals and crops, by the slow turning of seasons. One morning, as she was hanging wash on the line behind her cabin, she heard hoofbeats approaching. A rider emerged from the tree line, a young man on a dusty horse, his face sun-weathered beneath a broad hat. "Morning, ma'am," he called, tipping his hat. "I'm looking for Caleb Turner. This his place?" "It is. He's in the south pasture, checking fence." Margaret studied the stranger, noting the way he sat his horse with easy confidence. "Can I help you with something?" "Name's Jake Morrison. I heard in town Mr. Turner might be looking for a hand come roundup time. Thought I'd ride out and ask." "I see. You can wait if you like." He should be back within the hour. Jake dismounted, tying his horse to the fence rail. He was young, perhaps 25, with an open, honest face that reminded Margaret of her own son at that age. "Much obliged. Been riding since dawn. Came up from Wyoming looking for work." Margaret offered him water from the pump and invited him to sit on the porch while he waited. Jake accepted gratefully, and they fell into easy conversation. He'd worked ranches since he was 15, he told her, and knew cattle and horses both. His last employer had sold out to a bigger operation, leaving Jake and several others looking for new positions. "Mr. Turner treats his people fair?" Jake asked, then colored slightly. "Meaning no offense, ma'am. Just want to know what I'm walking into." "None taken. And yes, he's a fair man, honest and decent." Margaret found herself speaking with conviction. "You'll do well here if you're willing to work hard." When Caleb returned and found Jake waiting, Margaret watched their interaction from the kitchen window. They spoke for perhaps 20 minutes, Caleb asking questions while Jake answered with straightforward directness. Then they shook hands, and Margaret knew the decision had been made. "Hired him on," Caleb confirmed later over the midday meal. "Seems like a good kid. He'll stay in the bunkhouse, help with roundup and the summer work. Having an extra hand will make things easier." Margaret nodded, but something in her chest tightened slightly. The presence of another person on the ranch would change the quiet intimacy that had developed between them. She immediately felt guilty for the selfish thought. Jake proved to be everything he'd claimed: hardworking, skilled, and respectful. He kept to the bunkhouse mostly, joining them only for meals. But his presence did alter the dynamic, creating a formality where before there had been ease. Margaret and Caleb spoke less at supper now, aware of Jake's polite but attentive presence. One evening, about a week after Jake's arrival, Margaret was washing dishes when she heard raised voices from outside. She moved to the window and saw Caleb and Jake standing near the barn, their postures tense. "I'm just saying what I heard in town," Jake was saying, his voice carrying on the still air. "People talk, Mr. Turner. They're saying things about you and Mrs. Hale that aren't, well, they aren't respectful." Caleb's voice was low and dangerous. "What people say is none of your concern." "I know that, sir, but I thought you should know what's being said. That boarding house woman, Mrs. Kelly, she's been spreading stories. Says it's not proper, you two living out here alone. Even with me here now, she's saying—" Jake stopped, clearly uncomfortable. "Saying what?" Caleb's tone could have cut glass. "That Mrs. Hale is, well, that she's not really your housekeeper. That it's an arrangement of a different sort." Margaret felt heat flood her face. She gripped the edge of the sink, her knuckles white. "You listen to me carefully," Caleb said, his voice deadly quiet. "Mrs. Hale is a respectable woman who's done nothing but honest work since she arrived here. Anyone who suggests otherwise is a liar and a gossip. That includes Mrs. Kelly and anyone else who's got nothing better to do than tear down good people." "I know that, sir. I'm just telling you what's being said so I can what? Defend myself to every small-minded fool in Silver Ridge?" Caleb's laugh was bitter. "I've got better things to do with my time." Jake shifted his weight. "People might listen if you and Mrs. Hale were to make things more official. Get married, I mean. That would stop the talk." The silence that followed was so complete Margaret could hear her own heartbeat. She should move away from the window, give them privacy, but she was frozen in place. "That's not your business," Caleb said finally, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "No, sir, I apologize. I overstepped." "You did. Now get back to work." Jake retreated quickly, leaving Caleb standing alone in the yard. Margaret watched as he removed his hat, ran his hand through his hair, then replaced the hat with a sharp, frustrated motion. He stood there for a long moment before walking toward the barn, his shoulders tight with tension. Margaret turned away from the window, her mind spinning. Marriage. The word hung in her thoughts like smoke. She hadn't considered it, not seriously. Their arrangement had been working perfectly. Why complicate it with legal bonds and expectations? But Jake was right about one thing. The gossip would continue, would likely worsen, as long as their situation remained ambiguous. In a town like Silver Ridge, reputation mattered, a woman's reputation especially. That evening, the tension at supper was palpable. Jake ate quickly and excused himself early, clearly wanting to escape the uncomfortable atmosphere. When he was gone, Margaret and Caleb sat in silence, the untouched food growing cold on their plates. "You heard," Caleb said finally. It wasn't a question. "I did. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but voices carry. I'm sorry for what's being said about you. You don't deserve that." Margaret set down her fork carefully. "Is it true? About Mrs. Kelly spreading stories?" "Probably. She's always been one for gossip. After Sarah died, she made it her business to tell everyone how I was managing, what I was eating, how the house looked, like she had some kind of claim on knowing my business." "What do you want to do about it?" Caleb looked at her directly. "What do you want to do?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Margaret considered her options, turning them over like stones in her hand. She could leave, find employment elsewhere, protect her reputation by putting distance between herself and Caleb. She could stay and endure the gossip, let it wash over her like rain, and hope it eventually stopped. Or, "Jake mentioned marriage," she said carefully, watching Caleb's face. He flinched slightly, as if she'd struck him. He had no right to suggest that. It's not his place. But he's not wrong about the effect it would have. The gossip would stop if we made things official. "Margaret, I won't have you pressured into something you don't want. We have a good arrangement here. It works. That should be enough." "Should be. But is it?" She stood, moving to the window where she'd stood earlier. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. "I've lived my whole life concerned with what's proper, what people think. When I was young, I did what my parents expected. Then I did what my husband needed. Then what my children thought was best. I answered that advertisement because I wanted something different, something that was mine." She turned to face him. "But I'm tired, Caleb. Tired of fighting gossip, tired of defending myself, tired of watching you have to explain our arrangement to people like Mrs. Kelly, who will never understand or approve no matter what we say." "So what are you saying?" Margaret took a breath, steadying herself. "I'm saying that maybe Jake wasn't entirely wrong. Maybe marriage would solve more problems than it would create." Caleb stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I won't marry you just to stop gossip. That's not fair to either of us." "Then why would you marry me?" The question was bold, perhaps too bold, but Margaret was past caring about propriety. She needed to know what he felt, what he wanted, whether this thing growing between them was real or just convenience dressed up in companionship. Caleb crossed the room until he stood before her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his gray-green eyes. "I'd marry you because when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I think about is whether you're already awake, whether you'll smile at me over coffee. Because when I'm out with the cattle, I find myself hurrying back just to sit across from you at supper. Because you make this house feel alive again in a way it hasn't since Sarah died." He reached out, his calloused fingers brushing her cheek with surprising gentleness. "I'd marry you because somewhere along the way, you stopped being my housekeeper and became the person I can't imagine living without. But I won't ask you to marry me out of obligation or to silence small-minded gossips. You deserve better than that." Margaret's heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. "What if I wanted it too? Not because of gossip or obligation, but because I feel the same way you do." "Do you?" "Yes." The word came out barely above a whisper. "I tried not to. I told myself I was too old for such feelings, that this was just friendship and convenience. But I was lying to myself." Caleb's hand cupped her face fully now, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "You're sure? Because once we do this, there's no going back. We'd be bound together, for better or worse.
I'm sure. Are you? Instead of answering with words, Caleb leaned down and kissed her, gently at first, tentative, as if asking permission. Margaret's hands moved to his shoulders, pulling him closer, answering his question with her own certainty. The kiss deepened, carrying with it all the longing and loneliness of the past years, all the quiet moments of connection that had been leading to this. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. Caleb rested his forehead against hers, his hand still framing her face. "We'll do this properly," he said. "I'll speak to the minister, arrange everything. No more fuel for gossip. We'll marry in the church with the whole town watching if that's what it takes." I don't need the whole town. But you deserve it. A real wedding with witnesses and celebration, not something furtive and rushed. Margaret smiled against his shoulder. All right, a real wedding. But soon, Caleb. I don't want to wait. Neither do I. They stood together in the lamplight, holding each other, and Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope.
Not the desperate, fragile hope she'd carried on that train to Silver Ridge, but something stronger, built on solid ground. The next morning, Caleb rode into town to speak with Reverend Michaels. He returned with news that the minister would be happy to perform the ceremony in 2 weeks' time, on a Sunday afternoon following the regular service. "He seemed pleased," Caleb reported. "Said it was about time I found companionship again. He knew Sarah, spoke well of her." Margaret was working on her dress, a soft dove-gray silk that Ruth had helped her find in the mercantile's back room. It wasn't white, wasn't traditional, but it was beautiful and dignified, and it suited her perfectly. Ruth had been ecstatic when Margaret told her the news, arriving the next day with armloads of fabric and notions. "I knew it," she'd crowed. "I told you, didn't I, that there was something between you two." "You did," Margaret admitted, laughing at her friend's enthusiasm. "And that'll show Mrs. Kelly and her gossips a proper church wedding. They'll have to accept you then." But Margaret found she cared less about their acceptance than she once had. She was marrying Caleb because she wanted to, because in the quiet spaces of ranch life they'd found something worth keeping, what the town thought was secondary. Word of the upcoming wedding spread quickly. Some received the news with genuine pleasure, Ruth and her husband, several of the ranchers who knew and respected Caleb, the shopkeepers who had been kind to Margaret. Others reacted with barely concealed disapproval, as if a woman of 58 had no right to remarry, to seek happiness again. Margaret encountered Mrs. Kelly at the mercantile one afternoon, selecting ribbons for her dress. The older woman's face pinched like she'd bitten into something sour. "Mrs. Hale, I hear congratulations are in order." Her tone suggested the opposite. "Thank you," Margaret said evenly, not taking the bait. "It's all very sudden, isn't it? You've only been here a few months." "Long enough to know my own mind," Mrs. Kelly sniffed. "Well, I suppose at your age you can't afford to be too particular. Not many men would take on a woman past her prime." The comment was designed to wound, and it did. But Margaret had learned something in her months at the ranch. She was stronger than she'd known, more resilient than anyone had given her credit for. "You're right," she said calmly, meeting Mrs. Kelly's eyes. "At my age, I can't afford to waste time on people who don't matter. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a wedding to prepare for." She paid for her ribbons and left, her head high, leaving Mrs. Kelly sputtering behind her. That evening, she told Caleb about the encounter. He listened, his jaw tightening with anger, but Margaret stopped him before he could speak. "It doesn't matter. She doesn't matter. The only opinions I care about are yours and mine." She had no right. She had every right to her opinion. I just don't have to let it affect me. Margaret reached across the table, taking his hand. "I've spent too much of my life caring what others think. I'm done with that." Caleb turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. "You're remarkable. You know that? I'm just tired of being small to make other people comfortable." The days before the wedding passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret finished her dress with Ruth's help, the gray silk falling in elegant lines that flattered her figure. She had no veil, but Ruth fashioned a small crown of spring flowers that would be fresh picked the morning of the ceremony. Jake, once he learned of the engagement, became their unexpected ally. He cleaned the bunkhouse thoroughly, insisting that he and any wedding guests from out of town could bunk there, giving Margaret and Caleb privacy in the main house after the ceremony. It's the least I can do, he said when Caleb tried to protest. You're giving me steady work and fair wages. Besides, I like seeing you happy, sir, both of you. The night before the wedding, Margaret sat alone in her cabin for the last time. Tomorrow she would move her belongings into the main house, into the room that had been Caleb's alone for 3 years. The thought brought equal parts nervousness and anticipation. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Caleb standing on the small porch, hat in hand. I know it's not proper for me to be here the night before, he said, but I wanted to give you something. He held out a small wooden box, clearly handmade. Margaret took it, running her fingers over the smooth wood. Open it, Caleb said softly. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, was a ring. Not gold or silver, but carved from wood, the same warm pine as the box. It was simple and beautiful, polished to a soft sheen. I made it myself, Caleb said, his voice uncertain. I know it's not fancy, not what you probably expected, but I wanted you to have something that came from my own hands, something made just for you. Margaret's eyes stung with tears. She lifted the ring carefully, holding it up to the lamplight. The grain of the wood caught the light, creating patterns like water. It's perfect, she whispered. Caleb, it's perfect. You're sure? I can buy you a proper gold ring in town if you'd rather. No. She looked at him, this man who had given her shelter when she had nowhere to go, who had offered her work when she needed purpose, who had somehow become the person she couldn't imagine living without. This is what I want. Something real, something honest. Just like you. He stepped into the cabin, and she went into his arms. They stood there for a long moment, holding each other in the lamplight. Tomorrow, Caleb murmured against her hair. Tomorrow you'll be my wife. Tomorrow, Margaret agreed, and every day after. He kissed her then, slow and deep, a promise of things to come. When he finally pulled away, both were flushed and breathing hard. I should go, he said reluctantly. Let you rest. Stay, Margaret said, just a little longer. So he stayed, and they sat together in the small cabin, talking quietly about everything and nothing. About the ranch and the future, about Sarah and Charles, about the strange paths that had led them both to this moment. When he finally left, well past midnight, Margaret felt a peace settle over her that she'd never known before. Tomorrow, she would marry Caleb Turner. Tomorrow, she would become his wife, his partner, his companion in this life they were building together. She thought about the woman who had stepped off that train in February, lost, rejected, uncertain of everything. That woman had been broken down to her foundations and rebuilt into something stronger. Margaret Hale was no longer someone's discarded mail-order bride. She was no longer defined by the children who had no room for her or the husband whose memory she'd been living in. She was becoming Margaret Turner, and that woman was someone entirely new, someone forged in the crucible of rejection and rebuilt through work, friendship, and unexpected love. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars scattered across the black sky like diamonds. Inside, Margaret prepared for bed, her heart full of a quiet joy she'd thought was lost to her forever. Tomorrow would be a new beginning. But unlike the false start with Harlan Pierce, this one was real, built on truth and tested by hardship. She placed the wooden ring on her bedside table where she could see it, and lay down, finally allowing herself to smile fully, to acknowledge the happiness blooming in her chest like spring flowers after a long, hard winter. Morning came soft and golden, the May sun washing the ranch in warm light that seemed to bless the day ahead. Margaret woke early, her heart already racing with anticipation and nerves. She lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch coming to life. The rooster's crow, the lowing of cattle, the creak of the barn door as Jake began his morning chores. Today, she would marry Caleb Turner. The thought filled her with a giddy mixture of joy and disbelief. A knock came at her cabin door, and Ruth's voice called out, "Margaret, are you decent? I brought breakfast and I'm not leaving until I see you eat every bite." Margaret smiled, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders before opening the door. Ruth bustled in carrying a basket that smelled of fresh biscuits and honey, her face bright with excitement. "You look like you didn't sleep a wink," Ruth announced, setting down the basket and immediately fussing with Margaret's hair. We'll need to do something about those circles under your eyes. Nothing a cold compress and some color in your cheeks won't fix. Ruth, you're like a mother hen.
Someone needs to be. You're getting married and Ruth consulted the small watch pinned to her dress. 4 hours, and you're sitting here looking like you've seen a ghost. I'm just nervous. Good nervous or bad nervous? Margaret considered the question honestly. Good nervous, scared nervous, happy nervous, all of it at once. Ruth sat beside her on the bed, taking her hand. That's exactly how you should feel. Marriage is terrifying, even the second time around.
You're binding your life to another person's, trusting that they'll be there through everything that comes. She squeezed Margaret's fingers. But I've watched you and Caleb together. What you have is real. It's built on something solid. What if I'm too old for this? What if I've forgotten how to be a wife? Margaret Hale, soon to be Turner, you listen to me. You're not too old for anything. You've been more alive in these past 3 months than most people are in their entire lives. You faced rejection and didn't break. You built a new life from nothing. You held a gun on a dangerous man to protect what matters to you. Ruth's eyes were fierce. That's not someone who's too old. That's someone who's finally living. The words settled over Margaret like a blessing. She squeezed Ruth's hand back, feeling tears prickle her eyes. Thank you. For being here. For being my friend. Where else would I be? Now eat these biscuits before they get cold, and then we're going to make you the most beautiful bride Silver Ridge has ever seen. Over the next hours, Ruth worked her magic. She helped Margaret wash and pin up her hair in an elegant style that was both sophisticated and suitable for a woman of her age. The crown of wildflowers, fresh picked that morning by Jake, of all people, added a touch of softness. The gray silk dress fit perfectly, its color bringing out the blue in Margaret's eyes and complementing her silver-streaked hair rather than fighting against it. When Margaret finally looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because she looked younger, she didn't, and she was glad of it, but because she looked happy. Truly, deeply happy in a way that radiated from somewhere inside and transformed her entire face. You're stunning, Ruth whispered, tears in her own eyes. Caleb's going to forget how to breathe when he sees you. A wagon arrived to carry them to town. Jake driving, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday best, but grinning nonetheless. Margaret climbed up carefully, mindful of her dress, and Ruth settled beside her. As they rolled down the familiar road toward Silver Ridge, Margaret found her hands trembling slightly. It's not too late to turn around, Jake called back with a mischievous grin. I could have you back at the ranch in 20 minutes. Don't you dare, Ruth scolded, but Margaret laughed, grateful for the moment of levity. The church came into view, its white steeple rising against the blue Montana sky. Already, wagons and horses clustered around it, and people in their finest clothes moved toward the entrance. More people than Margaret had expected. Word had clearly spread, and curiosity, if nothing else, had brought out a crowd. Jake helped them down from the wagon, and Ruth immediately began fussing with Margaret's dress, smoothing wrinkles that didn't exist. Ready? Ruth asked. Margaret took a deep breath. Ready. They walked together toward the church entrance, and conversations died as people noticed them. Margaret kept her head high, her shoulders back, refusing to be cowed by stares. She was done caring what most of these people thought. Inside the church, the afternoon light streamed through simple windows, casting patterns on the worn wooden floors. The pews were filling rapidly, people craning their necks to get a better view. Margaret's eyes went immediately to the front of the church, where Caleb stood waiting beside Reverend Michaels. He had dressed in his best, a dark suit she'd never seen before, his hair neatly combed, his beard trimmed close. But it was his face that stopped her breath. The moment their eyes met, everything else fell away. She saw nervousness there, and joy, and something deeper, a certainty that matched her own. Ruth squeezed her arm. Go on, he's waiting for you. Margaret began walking down the aisle, and the church fell completely silent. She was aware of faces turning to watch her, some kind, some curious, some still disapproving. She saw Mrs. Kelly in a pew near the back, her mouth pressed into a thin line of judgment. She saw Ruth's husband grinning broadly. She saw Jake slip into a pew near the front, giving her an encouraging nod. But mostly, she saw Caleb. With each step, she moved closer to him, to this new life they were choosing together. When she reached the front of the church, he extended his hand to her and she took it, feeling the familiar calluses, the warmth, the strength.
"You're beautiful," he whispered, so quietly only she could hear. "So are you," she whispered back, and saw his eyes crinkle with suppressed laughter. Reverend Michaels cleared his throat, and the ceremony began. His words washed over Margaret in waves, talk of partnership and commitment, of the sacred bonds of marriage, of two people choosing to walk through life together.
She had heard it all before, at her first wedding nearly 40 years ago. But then she'd been a girl of 19 who understood so little of what those words truly meant. Now, at 58, she understood. Marriage wasn't about perfection or romance or the passionate certainty of youth. It was about choosing someone day after day, about building something together through work and patience and small kindnesses. It was about being seen fully and choosing to stay anyway. "Do you, Caleb James Turner, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Michaels asked. "To have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Caleb's eyes never left Margaret's face. "I do." "And do you, Margaret Rosehale, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? To have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Margaret's voice was clear and steady. "I do." "The rings, please." Caleb reached into his pocket and withdrew the wooden ring he'd made for her, and also, to Margaret's surprise, a second ring, this one simple gold. He saw her questioning look and smiled slightly. "The wooden one is for your heart," he said softly. "This one is for your hand, so everyone knows you're mine." He slipped the gold band onto her finger, and Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. Then Ruth stepped forward, pressing a small ring into Margaret's palm, a gold band she'd helped Margaret purchase in secret the week before. Margaret slid it onto Caleb's finger, her hands shaking slightly. "By the power vested in me," Reverend Michaels intoned, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Caleb, you may kiss your bride." Caleb cupped Margaret's face in his hands, just as he had that night in the kitchen when everything had changed between them. Then he kissed her, tender and sweet, in front of the entire town. Margaret heard a smattering of applause, heard someone, probably Ruth, sniffling with happy tears. When they pulled apart, Caleb kept hold of her hand as they turned to face the congregation together. Margaret's eyes swept the crowd, seeing the mixture of reactions. Some people were genuinely smiling, Ruth crying openly now, Jake grinning like a fool, several ranchers nodding their approval. Others looked uncomfortable, uncertain how to react to this unexpected pairing. And in the back, Harlan Pierce stood alone, his face carefully blank. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Margaret felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no bitterness, no vindication, just a mild pity for a man who would never understand what he'd turned away. She looked back at Caleb, at her husband, and smiled. The reception was held in the church hall, tables laden with food brought by those who'd warmed to the match. There was music, a fiddle and guitar, and dancing, and toasts that ranged from genuinely heartfelt to awkwardly polite. Margaret found herself pulled into conversations with people she barely knew, all wanting to offer congratulations or advice, or simply satisfy their curiosity. Through it all, Caleb stayed close, his hand finding hers whenever they were separated, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos of celebration. When the music started, he led her onto the floor for the first dance as husband and wife. "How are you holding up?" he murmured as they swayed together. "I'm wonderful. Overwhelmed, but wonderful. We can leave whenever you want. Just say the word." Margaret looked around the hall, at Ruth laughing with her husband, at Jake attempting to dance with a shy young woman from town, at the community that had judged her but was now, however reluctantly, accepting her. "Not yet. Let's stay a little longer. Let them see we're not ashamed." "I could never be ashamed of you." They danced 3 more dances before Ruth appeared at Margaret's elbow, her face flushed from dancing and perhaps a bit of punch. "You should go," Ruth said, her voice warm with affection. "Start your married life. We'll handle things here." Margaret hugged her friend tightly. "Thank you for everything. Be happy. That's all the thanks I need." Caleb retrieved Margaret's shawl, and they slipped out of the hall into the evening air. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Jake had already driven the wagon back to the ranch, leaving them Caleb's horse and a small buggy he'd borrowed for the occasion. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Margaret's hand rested on Caleb's knee, his hand covering hers, and the simple contact spoke volumes that words couldn't capture. When they arrived at the ranch, full dark had fallen, but Jake had lit lamps in the main house, leaving it glowing warmly in the night. A note on the table read, "Gone to town for the night. Congratulations. Jake." Caleb read it and chuckled. Tactful kid. Margaret moved through the house that was now fully hers, noticing the small changes Jake must have made. Fresh flowers in a vase on the table, wood stacked neatly by the stove, the floors swept clean. She was touched by his thoughtfulness. "Margaret." Caleb's voice was uncertain, almost nervous. She turned to find him watching her from across the room. "I want you to know, there's no expectations tonight. We can take this as slow as you need. I can sleep in the—" She crossed the room and placed her fingers against his lips, stopping the words. "Don't. Don't sleep anywhere but beside me." His eyes darkened and he pulled her close, kissing her with a passion that had been restrained all day. Margaret responded in kind, her arms wrapping around his neck, finally allowing herself to feel everything she'd been holding back. They made their way to their bedroom now, and what followed was tender and awkward and beautiful in the way of two people learning each other after so many years alone. They were not young lovers with the confidence of inexperience. They were two people marked by loss and time, carrying the memories of other partnerships, other intimacies. But that made it more precious somehow. Each touch was a choice, each whispered word a gift freely given. They loved each other with patience and care, building something new on the foundation of everything they'd survived. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, Margaret's head on Caleb's chest, his fingers trailing through her unbound hair. "I was afraid," Caleb said quietly, "when I saw you on that platform with Pierce. I almost didn't approach you. I thought you'd want to be left alone with your grief. What made you change your mind?" "The way you stood, like you were daring the world to try and break you." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I recognized that stance. I'd worn it myself often enough." Margaret traced patterns on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "I'm glad you saw me. Glad you were brave enough to offer help to a complete stranger. You're not a stranger anymore." "No, I'm your wife." The word still felt strange in her mouth, new and unfamiliar, but right, too. So very right. They talked deep into the night, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Margaret told him about her children's disappointment in her choices, about the years she'd spent feeling invisible in her own life. Caleb spoke of Sarah's death, of the guilt he carried for not getting her to a doctor sooner, of the loneliness that had become so familiar he'd almost stopped noticing it. "Do you think she would have approved?" Margaret asked. "Of us, I mean." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah was practical above all else. She would have wanted me to find companionship again, to not spend my life alone. And she would have liked you, your strength, your refusal to be beaten down. Yes, I think she would have approved. Charles would have too. He always said life was for the living, that we waste too much time mourning what's gone instead of embracing what's here." They fell asleep finally as the first hints of dawn touched the sky, wrapped in each other's arms, two people who had found their way to each other through the most unlikely of paths. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm, similar to before, but fundamentally changed. Margaret moved her belongings from the cabin to the main house, filling the empty spaces with her presence. They worked together during the days, Margaret tending the house and garden, while Caleb managed the ranch with Jake's help. But the evenings were theirs alone, spent in quiet conversation or comfortable silence, building the intimacy that comes from shared life. 2 weeks after the wedding, a letter arrived addressed to Mrs. Margaret Turner. Margaret recognized her daughter Elizabeth's handwriting and felt her stomach clench. She hadn't written to tell her children about the marriage, uncertain how they would react. She opened the letter with trembling fingers while Caleb watched from across the table. The letter was brief and cold. Elizabeth had heard about the marriage from a friend who had family in Montana. She was shocked and disappointed that her mother hadn't seen fit to inform her own children of such a significant decision. She felt Margaret was making poor choices, acting impulsively, and refused to give her blessing to this hasty and ill-considered union. Margaret set the letter down carefully, fighting back tears. Caleb reached across the table, covering her hand with his. What does she say? That I'm foolish and impulsive, that she's ashamed of my choices. Caleb's jaw tightened with anger. You want me to write to her? Tell her? No. Margaret took a deep breath, steadying herself. No, this is mine to handle. She rose and went to the small desk in the corner, pulling out paper and pen. Caleb watched as she began to write, the words flowing faster than she'd expected. Dear Elizabeth, she wrote, I received your letter and I understand your disappointment, but I need you to understand something. I am 58 years old. I have lived according to other people's expectations for most of my life. My parents, my husband's, my children's. I have been dutiful and proper and careful, and it brought me to a place where my own son suggested I retire to a boarding house to live out my remaining years in quiet obscurity. I refused that future. I chose instead to take a risk, to answer an advertisement that might have led to happiness or disaster. It led to disaster first, a public rejection that would have broken a lesser person. But then it led to something unexpected. It led to Caleb, to this ranch, to work that gives me purpose, and a partnership that makes me feel alive again. I will not apologize for choosing life over slow decline. I will not feel ashamed for finding love again, even at my age. Caleb Turner is a good man who treats me with respect and kindness. He sees me as a person of value, not as a burden to be managed. If you cannot be happy for me, I am sorry for that, but I will not change my course to suit your expectations. I am done living my life according to what others think is proper. Your mother, Margaret Turner. She sealed the letter and set it aside to be mailed. When she turned back to Caleb, she found him watching her with an expression of such pride and affection that it made her breath catch. That was well done, he said quietly. It needed to be said. I should have said it years ago. A month passed, then two. Summer settled over the ranch in full force, bringing long days of work and short nights of rest. The cattle thrived, the garden produced abundantly, and the ranch ran smoothly with 3 sets of hands to manage it. Margaret received a second letter from Elizabeth, shorter than the first. Her daughter was still struggling to understand Margaret's choices, but she acknowledged that perhaps she had been unfair in her judgment. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was a step toward acceptance. Margaret would take it. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Caleb said, I've been thinking about expanding the herd, maybe buying that section of land to the north that adjoins our property. What do you think? Margaret considered, touched that he was asking her opinion on ranch business. Can we afford it? With Jake's help, we had a better calf crop this year than I've had in 5 years. And the beef prices are holding steady. It would be tight, but I think we could manage it. Then I think we should do it. Build something lasting. Caleb took her hand, lacing their fingers together. Build something to pass on, you mean? Perhaps. Someday. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the day fade into night. Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her here, the hope and devastation, the kindness and cruelty, the unexpected grace of second chances. She thought about the woman who had stood on that train platform, abandoned and alone, and how that woman had refused to break. How she had built herself into something stronger through work and determination and the simple refusal to give up. What are you thinking about? Caleb asked. About beginnings, Margaret said. How sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can lead to the best thing. If Harlan Pierce hadn't rejected me, I never would have met you. I've thought about that too. About how many small choices and chances had to align perfectly to bring us both to that moment. He squeezed her hand. Makes you think fate might be real after all. Or luck. Or grace. Whatever you want to call the force that takes broken things and makes them whole again. A coyote called in the distance, its voice lonely and wild. Margaret leaned her head against Caleb's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. She was 58 years old. She had been married before, raised children, buried a husband, lived through loss and loneliness. She had been rejected and humiliated, left standing on a train platform like discarded goods. But she had survived all of it. More than survived, she had transformed it into something beautiful. She had taken the broken pieces of her life and built something new, something that was entirely hers. "I love you," she said. The words simple but weighted with meaning. Caleb turned to look at her, his weathered face soft with emotion. "I love you too. More than I thought I could love anyone again." They sat together as the stars began to emerge, one by one, pinpricks of light in the vast darkness. The ranch settled around them, the soft sounds of horses in the barn, the rustle of wind through grass, the distant murmur of the creek. This was her life now. Not the life she had imagined when she boarded that train in Kansas, not the fairy tale of romance she might have dreamed of as a girl, but something better, something real and solid and earned through her own strength and courage. Margaret Turner had been the bride no one wanted. She had been deemed too old, too plain, too past her prime for new beginnings. But sitting here on this porch, her hand in her husband's hand, watching the Montana sky turn to velvet, she knew the truth that Pierce and all the doubters would never understand. Love didn't have an expiration date. Life didn't end when youth faded, and it was never, ever too late to begin again. Sometimes the best chapters of a story came not at the beginning, but in the middle, when you'd learned enough to appreciate them fully. Sometimes love arrived not with the passion of youth, but with the deeper certainty that came from having survived, from knowing exactly what you were choosing and why. As the last light faded from the sky and the stars blazed overhead in their ancient patterns, Margaret closed her eyes and breathed in the cool evening air. She was home. She was loved. She was exactly where she was meant to be. And that, she thought with a quiet smile, was the greatest gift life could offer. Not perfection, but belonging. Not romance, but partnership. Not rescue, but the chance to rescue yourself and find that someone was waiting to walk beside you when you did. The night deepened around them, but Margaret felt no fear of darkness. She had learned that sometimes you had to lose everything to find what truly mattered. Sometimes you had to be broken down to your foundations before you could build something that would last. And sometimes, when you thought all hope was gone, life surprised you with a second chance you never expected but definitely deserved. She opened her eyes and looked at Caleb, this man who had seen her worth when others saw only age. This man who had offered kindness without expecting anything in return. This man who had become her partner, her friend, her love. "Ready to go inside?" he asked softly. Margaret stood, keeping hold of his hand. "Ready." Together they walked into the warmth of the house they shared, into the life they were building day by day, into the future that stretched before them full of ordinary days and simple joys, and the profound satisfaction of having chosen well. The door closed behind them with a soft click, shutting out the night, but not the stars that continued to shine overhead, bearing witness to all the unlikely miracles that happen when people are brave enough to keep standing, keep hoping, keep believing that tomorrow might hold something beautiful. And in Silver Ridge, Montana, in a small ranch house at the edge of the wilderness, two people who had found each other through the most improbable of circumstances settled into their evening routine, making tea, stoking the fire, preparing for bed, with the comfortable intimacy of those who know they have found their home not in a place, but in each other.